you can't win your fantasy baseball league in your draft, but you can definitely get a big edge by picking the right players at the right time. There's a good time to look at ADP and which players are being valued way too high or too low. I've got 8 really interesting names lined up that I want to talk about and break down whether they are guys to buy or sell on draft day. Let's start with a pitcher who was a 30-year-old rookie last year. That's Kodai Senga from the New York Mets. Well, let's just say he did better than the Mets as a team did. He started out a little rough, not a great April, but really settled down and then was lights out, especially after the All-Star break. In 13 starts in the second half of the season, he posted a 2.58 ERA and a 1.15 whip. He also accounted for 89 strikeouts in 76 innings after the All-Star break, wound up with a total of 202 strikeouts in only 166 innings. He was basically everything that you could have hoped for a rookie acquisition for this Mets team that otherwise was largely disappointing. Right now, early ADP over the last couple of weeks in NFBC drafts, which is a high-stakes league. Some of the best drafters, the smartest fantasy baseball players are on there already. His ADP is 73 overall. Is that too high or too low? Well, I'll tell you, in my most recent NFBC 50, I just took Senga a little earlier than that in the 60s, and I have no regrets. I think that this is actually low for him because this is a guy who can easily repeat what he's done. Obviously, not a young pitcher, someone who is already established in the Japanese league, but also now has a full season under his belt in the majors. He's got a great ballpark factor working for him there in City. He had a 29% K rate. That is the kind of pitcher that you want to go in on. Yeah, it's easy to focus on the ERA and the whip and the ratios. Those can fluctuate, but the strikeout rate should hold pretty consistent. I chase the strikeout rate and the swing and miss stuff. He has got that. And so Senga, I think, is being a little bit undervalued. That leads me to another veteran right-handed starter who is now getting a lot of hype this preseason, especially Pablo Lopez. After 5 seasons for the Marlins in their rotation, all it took, of course, was leaving Miami for him to become an all-star. Lopez had his best season yet, led to his first all-star appearance, and he was one of the leaders with 234 strikeouts on the season. Now you look at the ratios, it's really interesting because you would expect a big step forward also, but that's not exactly what happened. Last year, he posted a 3.66 ERA and a 1.15 whip. The year before that in Miami, it was a 3.75 ERA and a 1.16 whip. Almost identical. Look at his career averages, 3.86 for ERA, 1.17 for whip. Very consistent, very solid. But here's the thing. Some people, I feel like, are expecting a step forward as if he's going to get better, which sure is possible. This guy's not that old. He's 27 years old. Only 1 year in Minnesota. Maybe he gets a little bit better. Seeing batters the second time around, that's usually not how it works. With interleague, I don't even think the AL-NL thing matters that much. There's not a big difference in park factor. In fact, you know what? Miami's always been very pitcher friendly, and so you would expect maybe a slight step back playing in Minnesota. That didn't happen. All things considered, the bottom line is we should just expect more of the same from Lopez. That's good. That's really good, especially you can rack up over 200 strikeouts. But here's the thing. His ADP right now, based off of last season's performance, is 43. I think that's way too high. I just talked about a guy like Senga who had an ERA that was a full run better and a very similar strikeout rate. He didn't pitch as many innings as Lopez and it wasn't as high, but still, it's pretty comparable. And you have a full, 3-round difference here. I don't see why the gap is that big. And again, I feel like Lopez being a little overvalued. It seems reasonable when you look at the other pitchers that are in his range. You think, okay, I'll take Lopez. He's solid. He's pretty consistent. But also, it seems like people are forgetting he did have some injury problems the first couple of years of his career. I don't feel like he's really the safe pick that people think he is. So I don't hate taking him around the 50s or 60s. Again, I don't see why he's going as high as he is. Now, on the offensive side of things, there was no player really more exciting in the league than Elly De La Cruz, especially when he debuted. Just watching him run the base paths was a thing of joy for all baseball fans. He was an instant impact bat, and by the time the season was finished, he had 13 home runs and 35 stolen bases. That was in just 388 at-bats. Here's the downside, and yes, there is a downside. You know this if you did have De La Cruz in your fantasy league. His batting average went up at .235, and his strikeout rate was 33.7%. You can imagine, one of the worst in the majors. And while being part of this young, exciting new offense with so many different options, guys like Matt McClain, Noelvi Marte, yeah, that's great for him, but it might also work against him because now we'll see, based on his on-base percentage, he's going to be hitting lower in the order. He might not be that leadoff guy or even that number 2 guy. Might see him hit 6th or 7th. That means less at-bats. That means less chances to score runs, drive in runs, but also maybe a little bit less often he gets the green light. Look, when he's on the base pass, sure, he will probably run whenever he gets a chance, but you got to get on base and you got to be up to the plate in order to get on base. So you see there's a little bit of a snowball effect here. An ADP right now of 21? Are you kidding me? We're going to take this guy in the 2nd round and just hope that he becomes a megastar, just assume that he's going to be hitting every day in that lineup? I don't know. And a guy who you know is probably not going to hit above 250, it's way too rich for my blood. I don't mind taking De La Cruz, taking a chance on a guy in the early rounds, but there are other players who are far safer that also have similar upside. And look, I don't love the early ADP of Michael Harris because I also think he's being a little bit elevated in terms of what his ceiling might be, but I feel a lot safer taking him than De La Cruz, and I can get him around later. So that brings me to another Cincinnati Red, a new Red, and kind of a surprising addition during the offseason. They signed Jeimer Candelario. Why on this team that has so much young talent on offense and seemingly has almost a logjam in the infield, did they sign a 30-year-old slugger, basically, to play first base? Well, if they want to win and be an actual postseason contender, they need a little bit of experience on there, and Candelario will give them that. He'll give them some consistency, a steady bat, so he can hold down an infield spot. And he's actually been pretty good the last couple of years after a disappointing start in Detroit. Last year for Washington, the switch hitting Candelario, 22 home runs and 70 RBIs. But he moves from a team in Washington where playing at Nationals Park, last 3 years, rolling average and ballpark factor, the Nationals was 16th for home runs. Whereas opposed to the Great American Ballpark, Cincinnati, was number 2. And if you look at just last year alone, was number 1. Much friendly environment for a power hitter. Now the question is, are you buying into him for fantasy? Is this guy even worth drafting? Especially when you look at the fact that Candelario is not even being drafted inside the top 200 overall, which is hard to believe. I know we don't get thrilled with a guy like this. He's been around a while, never shown this tremendous ceiling. Don't feel like he's a guy who's set to break out with like a 30 home run season. But I really think he could, and even if he doesn't, at a pick around 217 overall, why would you not take a chance on a guy who has his type of power? Back to the young players, though. Here's someone who's being selected much higher, but there's also some question mark about Evan Carter. I know, he's on the Rangers. He had a great end to last season. We even appeared in the postseason and didn't seem scared as a rookie. This guy's one of the top prospects in all of baseball. What's not to buy into? Well, there are also some questions about, is he going to play really every day because he's in that Rangers lineup, which has other options, and is he going to play enough against lefties? Let's try to answer each of those questions. So first of all, last year in 62 at-bats, he hit .305 with 5 home runs and 3 stolen bases. Showed you he can hit for average, power, and give you some speed. I've seen it pointed out that against lefties, he did really badly, but honestly, I'm just going to completely throw that argument out because he only had like 10 at-bats against left-handed pitchers. Are we really going to read into that as far as the sample size? This guy did not struggle throughout the minor leagues against left-handed pitching. And as far as playing time, well, yeah, the Rangers are a good team, but really, who is taking playing time away from him? I know White Langford, we'll see what his role is going to be. The guy could definitely come in and step in and be an everyday player. I think there's room for both of them. And look, right now, if you look on roster resource, Carter is slated to be the cleanup hitter for this team. Are they really going to pull him on odd days? I don't think so. Right now, his ADP on NFBC is 111. I'll say I'll gladly take him in that range. In fact, I did just put him on one of my teams as well. The upside here is absolutely worth whatever risk you think there is. I think it's only going to be injury that might keep him out of the lineup, and that risk goes for any player you can talk about. Now we have a very similar player who did play last year and wound up being a fantasy stud. There were no questions, but also a lot of people weren't on Josh Lowe in Tampa because his initial time in the majors with Tampa, it looked awful. Well, last year, he wound up being a stud. If you wound up picking him up off waivers, let's face it, nobody actually drafted him as far as I know. He hit 20 home runs, stole 32 bases, and wound up with a batting average of .292. Still just 25 years old, on a great team. What is there to question? Right now, I will say this. There's probably going to be a cap on his total play appearances, and that's what worries me because he basically will not hit against lefties. It's not even a concern, it's a fact. He just doesn't hit against left-handers because he does struggle against them. Last year and part of the year before when he's played his time in the majors, he has all of 63 at-bats against southpaws. Now you can look at last year and say, well, the same thing applies. He didn't really hit against lefties last year very much, and he had a great season. Why wouldn't he just put up similar numbers? He could. He definitely could. The batting average was there, but also you should look at the fact that his expected batting average was 15 points lower than his actual batting average. We could see some regression there if the Rays make more moves in the offseason. They've been busy already, a lot of movement here and there. I think Lowe is pretty much an everyday player against righties, but we really don't know how this roster is going to look by opening day yet. What I am wondering is, are we seeing him basically at what his peak is? Is he really going to exceed last year's stats, and are we drafting him too high? I would love to have Lowe on my team, but his ADP right now is 80, so I don't think so. I think it's a little too aggressive for me when I can wait 30 picks later and get a player like Evan Carter, who I think can do just as well, maybe not as many steals, but overall give me more in terms of fantasy production. I think the average is going to be higher. Sure, the steals will be lower, the power will be similar. And I think that the ADP is just a little too much for me right now with Josh Lowe, given that I think there is a cap on what he can produce. The same question applies to CJ Abrams in Washington, part of that Juan Soto trade, the one from a couple years ago, not this last one. He's been a high-end prospect last year, got a chance to be an everyday player, and managed to avoid injuries. Wound up stealing 47 bases. Right there, that's your fantasy appeal. This guy does have some pop too, though. Wound up with 18 home runs last season and scored 83 runs despite being in that Washington lineup. Zero question about playing time here. Almost sure to be the leadoff hitter. The batting average is not going to be a sink, but it's also not going to be a benefit. He hit .245, and I think that's right about where he's going to settle. I'm not sure that his run and RBI totals are really going to move much either. If I felt that there was a lot of room for growth in the other categories, I might say go for it. But you know what? I hate to make this comp, but regardless of injuries and all that, this is feeling a little bit like Adalberto Mondesi to me. We're going all in on the tool set. We're, just enamored with the speed. We feel like this should be like a next superstar in baseball. I think that's a little too aggressive. Sure, he's not being drafted in the first round, but still an ADP of 38, it's just a little too much for me. So at this point, I've got to sell taking Abrams this high. And then another young outfielder I've already gotten several questions about this offseason is Riley Green in Detroit. Does he have the ceiling really to help you enough? Because definitely not a 40 home run threat, not a 40 steal threat. Are you going to get enough from this guy, even though he's being drafted much later, to really make it worth it? Before I give away my answer, let's take a look under the hood here. The concern with Green is injuries. Missed a lot of time last year, but when he was at the plate, he was really good. In fact, top 10 percentile in expected batting average at .289 and top 10 percentile in xWOBA bacon, which is expected weighted on base average on contact. Bottom line, he hits the ball really well, gets some quality contact when he's up at the plate. And though I just mentioned he's not a power hitter per se, surprisingly, he was also one of the best in terms of expected slugging, 88th percentile there with a .477 x slug mark. So he only had 11 home runs last year, but that wasn't just 378 at-bats. Green is what you call a professional hitter. He has patience at the plate. He knows how to get on base, so he's going to be most likely the leadoff guy, or at the very least the number 2 player in the order here for the Tigers. And I've kept saying it already in a couple of videos this offseason. Tigers are going to be one of those sneaky teams for fantasy where you might see more value than you expect. A lot of young talent, and this lineup is definitely going to be promising. I think we're seeing 600 plus at bats. That means I can project him for 20 plus, maybe even 25 home runs, score 80 plus runs, and get you one of the better batting averages in the league. Last year, it was just a stress fracture and some elbow inflammation that limited him. Yeah, those are things to watch for, but if he's healthy throughout the spring, I'm all in on him at his current ADP. 170, absolutely. Those are the players I'm buying or selling based on early ADP for fantasy baseball. But who are the best sleepers among all hitters? Well, check this out and you'll find out.